Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lee Gould. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Government Finance Officers. Thank you for joining us for our regular now weekly Wednesday webinar. I have to slow down to say that. It can be a bit of a tongue twister. Today we're joined by James and Brett from NMP to talk about long-range financial models. We're thrilled that we're able to bring us have a timely topic. So over to you guys. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lee. It's really fun when we're doing a coast-to-coast type of webinar like this, so we can say both good morning and good afternoon at the same time. So thanks to everyone for taking the time out to listen to Brett and I, and we're pretty excited to share this information with you, and how this has provided a lot of value to a number of different clients, and perhaps how it could be useful to you. So my name is James Richardson. I'm a partner in consulting here based out of the Edmonton office. And I also have the privilege of serving as the consulting leader for public sector in Alberta. I work closely with a good colleague of mine on our accounting side who leads the public sector as well. So we kind of cover off all areas. We have a good time working between kind of the consulting view and the accounting view, and work with a number of different clients, including many municipalities in Alberta and beyond. And Brett, why don't you introduce yourself here briefly?
Hi, I'm Brett Mantle. So I am currently a manager in our Toronto office. Previously, I've been in our Regina and Saskatoon office and tend to find myself in different parts of the country every now and then. My main focus is on what we call financial modeling and analysis. So a whole bunch of stuff like this, which is, I find it fun, interesting, and it's one of those things that gets used and provides a lot of value. So it's something I enjoy doing.
Thanks, Brett. We'll hear more from you shortly as we dive into some of the details. Now, for the audience, what we're going to talk about today is they're slightly different, but incredibly related things. So there's a long-range financial model, which you'll hear us refer to as an LRFM, and a long-range financial plan. So you change the last letter from M to P, and LRFP. So let's talk about the first one first. A long-range financial model. So as you can imagine, it's based in Excel. It's a pretty sophisticated modeling tool in there. And what it is a forward-looking management tool, and it captures key financial considerations. And we set it up is to see details in the first 5 years, and then some also summary information in the 10, 15, 20, 25-year period to help guide some financial decisions, especially in large organizations and municipalities in particular. You have a lot of work to do with infrastructure. Infrastructure is decisions you need to make in the near term if you're going to start something or work on something, but it has ramifications for at least the next 20, 30, 40, sometimes 50 years. So it's good to know what those ramifications are in those financial decisions. Now, in amongst that, you're also having regular operations. So you have revenues, you have operating costs, you have some of that asset management, which may include maintenance programs or small staged replacement initiatives. Then you have debt management and reserve management. So there's a lot of different variables working all at the same time that can affect decision making and affect decisions you want to make in the near term or on a staged basis. So the LRFM, we can scale it and customize it, and that's what we do and have done for our clients for any municipalities or different functions, organizational structures. It doesn't have to be a municipality, it's just where we've done a lot of the work on this recently with LRFMs. Now, one of the key outputs is it provides quantitative information that's used in developing a long-range financial plan. And that's the segue into what is an LRFP. So the LRFP is an output of the LRFM. So as you're working through and you're selecting the different variables that you want to model and consider, whether it's a change in revenues, whether it's shifting in costs, whether it's how you're going to use debt or schedule and work on different capital spending elements. When you've set those variables and create an output on the model, then you can come out with a long-range financial plan. And that plan is the analysis of what are the ramifications of if you make certain decisions, what will that look like? So when you have an LRFP output, this is the time when you can have that conversation as a strategic management tool saying, if this, then that. If we're making, certain decisions on what we're looking to do with revenues, so in the case of a municipality, that could be what we're looking at for changes in the tax rate or the mill rate and how that affects the individual taxes that ratepayers are going to be paying over time. An increase, a large increase, a moderate increase, that will all have ramifications in the near term and the longer term. Plus, it allows you to transparently demonstrate the long-term viability and sustainability of municipal decisions. For example, one client that Brett and I were working with, you had a council that was not too keen on any rate increases on the tax roll, to the point where almost zero was the preference. All those who are probably sitting there in the audience who are working in finance, cringing, saying zero is actually a negative because you're not even keeping up with the cost of living or inflation. And yes, they're starting from the same place, but when you can demonstrate, here's what happens when we make that decision, and you mull it out and show what those outputs and the ramifications are, they were able to have a different conversation. And that's critical. Having the right conversation for the right reasons is a lot of what this tool and these outputs create. So when you have an understanding of what happens to long-term viability or sustainability of some of those decisions, you can identify even areas for improvement. You can have financial policies that are not enabling or getting in your way. Some of your strategies might also need to shift in order to achieve both the near-term and longer-term objectives. And then you can generate those action plans to get to from where you are to where you want to be, making some different decisions. Whether that's changing the rates that ratepayers are paying, whether that's shifting some of the cost structure, or maybe that's looking at different use of debt vehicles or even reserves to achieve your objectives. Need to take a breath. So those are some of the a brief overview of what is an LRFM and what is an LRFP. Now let's talk a little bit about why would you want to use a tool such as that or work with a report that it generates. So we're currently dealing with a number of different challenges. Even before COVID-19 response and now entering into some of the recovery mode, we were dealing with a lot of economic uncertainty in different parts of the countries for different reasons. Certainly out west here where I'm from, energy uncertainty was a big impact on a lot of budgets. But then we have some of the other global issues and trade issues that were exacerbating other economic impacts. All municipalities need to deal with the aging infrastructure. I'm not sure that I know of any municipality that has everything brand new and doesn't have to worry about it for a long time. Wouldn't that be great? But no, it's not the case. Usually you're managing on a 5 to 10 year capital plan. And there's an element, a little bit of, fingers crossed sometimes that the assets are going to last as long as we've projected and based on the last inspection or identification of timeline. And then on top of that, we also have to work with changes in government funding and policy. So whether that's from the federal government and they're shifting what they're doing with some of the infrastructure funding, some of which the municipalities want to be able to access to help fund some of the expensive projects, right down to the provincial level. And for me, certainly what I see with municipalities here in Alberta, you have a provincial government, well, they put it on hold. They are looking at reactivating their review of non-residential assessment, which could make big impacts on a number of the revenue streams for municipalities in this province. So there's a lot of those uncertainties. Now overlay the fact that we've gone through the COVID response, now we're working to recovery, and both from whether it's residential ratepayers or non-residential ratepayers, their ability to pay, or even if they're a going concern on the business side, will have a major impact on potentially on revenues. But how much? What will happen? If one thing happens, what happens to everything else that we have planned? Those are the kind of variables that you can start to model. Now, I think we have full recognition that we're not lacking current approaches to be able to do this. When faced with a strategic question like, what if this happens? What will be the impacts? I think everybody that's in the audience and listening today is more than capable of taking that question, pulling the relevant data that you need, conducting that analysis in a very thorough and sophisticated way, and producing that report of those answers they get at the original question. But I think that one of the key elements here is that you usually get that dreaded new question. Oh, that's interesting. But what about this or what about that? And if we change this or that, then what happens? So we will go right back to the beginning, either modulate or collect any additional data that we need, work through the analysis, and then produce the report and answer those that provides from the analysis. So yes, it's effective, but the time-consuming exercise. And certainly in the world of finance, you have no lack of other things to work on, and key initiatives that also need to occupy your time. So what we're proposing with the LRFM and the resulting LRFP that comes out of it is a better approach that drastically shortens that timeline. So drastically shortens that timeline because you often hear that question: what's the shortest distance between 2 points? Well, the easy answer that we usually hear is a straight line. But if you want to bring in quantum physics, no, the shortest distance between 2 points is if they're right on top of each other. So when they're right on top of each other, if we can maintain that relevant data set, which all organizations already have in some form or another, in the organization around budget and costing and some of the GL and the day-to-day transactions, and you build a tool around that data. So you put them right on top of each other. And then you can have consistent outputs and reports to provide the analysis on those various questions and the levers that you might pull to make different decisions. So if you can work through a couple of clicks on the different variables that are built into a tool around your own data, the timeline to get to the answer and providing that strategic insight is much shorter, and then moves the finance role into more of a strategic advisory role, as opposed to the taking of the orders, looking through the analysis and providing those answers. So we're really excited about what we've seen in some of the impacts with our clients when they're able to shift the conversation. So whether it's with their leadership colleagues when they're looking at scenarios or issues and impacts, or even taking to their councils and boards and be able to talk through it in a more strategic perspective, and getting at what does the data show us in a quantitative manner, and to be able to have that conversation rather than just on a position versus position basis. So that timely and accurate analysis, consistent outputs that councils get acclimated to. Brett's going to walk us through some of that here shortly. When you're starting to use the tool and can leave behind the capability for that tool to be used more often, you're able to get into more of a cadence on having those conversations with some of the socialization and used to seeing what you're seeing, and be able to have those recognized reports and outputs that can support the conversations they need to have. So that ability to run and understand the impacts of multivariable scenarios, or a number of different things could happen, and what does that mean? That makes a big difference when you're navigating through whether it's the pre-COVID challenges or even layering on top of the challenges that we were now experiencing at this time. So with that, I just want to turn to Brett. And Brett, if you can walk us through some of the scenarios and give us a bit of a case study approach to saying, so how does this thing work anyways? I think you're on mute there, buddy. Please stand by. We will hear Brett's lovely voice shortly. And during this brief interlude, if you're wondering if it's a requirement to not have hair on the top of your head to work at M&P, in this particular service line, the answer is yes, because we actually burn it off with all of our cerebral processing, is what we'd like to tell ourselves. Brett, I'm still looking for your audio here. Okay, I've seen that microphone go away. Can we hear you now? No, don't hear you. Sorry, everyone. We had worked through the testing. Everything worked really well when we're in the testing mode. But much like if you want to pick on software implementation, user testing works really well, and then you put it into the live environment, and this is where we end up, sometimes with a couple of difficulties. Brad, have you found the ability to get your voice heard now? No, I'm afraid we don't hear you yet. And it's showing, that's a good question. So Brett, maybe you try working on that and I'll just walk us through a scenario, and then when sound comes through, I'll turn it back over to you, just in the interest of time. So what we put together for scenarios is, a best case, moderate case, worst case scenario outline. So for the simplification purposes, we've used 3 inputs: tax revenue, economic growth, and service cuts. So in a best case scenario, I would say, well, what we anticipate is a small decline in revenue, but a quick recovery. From an economic growth perspective, a medium decline and a near-term recovery. Brett, it looks like we might have your voice back now.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, no, everything was showing as normal, and I had to take myself off audio and put myself back on audio. So hopefully that's working better now.
You got the hammer. So I was just talking through the best case, and then from the best case scenario on the service cuts, we'd say no cuts required in the best case. So if you want to pick up from there and talk through the moderate case, worst case.
Yeah, perfect. So yeah, the moderate case is pretty similar to the best case, except we're seeing sort of a slightly larger decline in tax revenue within the first year. It's about the same recovery trajectory. And then same with economic growth, slightly larger decline, slightly slower recovery. And then with service cuts in this case, we're looking at about 5% to see if that sort of balances out the impact of the tax revenue as well as the economic growth declining. Now, in the worst case, we're looking at a pretty large decline in tax revenue and a slower recovery. So we're not getting back to zero until 5 years out instead of 3 years out. Same with economic growth, larger decline and a little slower recovery trajectory. And then in this case, we're looking at service cuts of 10%, just to try and overcome that. So I think one of the things we wanted to sort of show about the scenarios too is that all this data is based on work we've done before with previous clients. It's been sort of sanitized and anonymized, so you don't pick up any information you're not supposed to get. And then the other interesting thing about sort of the graphs that I'll show you on the next 3 slides is there's 6 of them in total. And I think it took about a little less than 5 minutes to produce them all. And then so what that really does is it sort of frees up a bunch of your time to then have conversations about some of the points of what to do about what the graphs show instead of having to produce the graphs. So in the first slide, we're looking at the best case scenario. But I'll take a moment to actually describe what the graphs you're looking at mean, so you'll make it a little easier to understand the difference. So in the top graph, the bar graph with the line, that line is indicated of the blue line of revenues. And then the bar graphs, the stacked bars, are the total expenditures. We've separated out the salaries and benefits as the orange bar, just because of the relative importance of salaries and benefits within most public sector municipal organizations. And then so you'll see the red circle is kind of where you've got it, where expenditures exceed revenues in this case. And then in the second graph, what we have is the blue line, again, represents the debt limit. In this case, this is based on the Alberta debt limits, so it's 1.5 times revenue. And the gray section represents total cumulative debt. So again, the red circle just kind of is over that one place where there's a bit of an issue, just one small sort of time where you exceed the limit in this case. So kind of in what we can see in this general case is that there's sort of potentially minor changes to operating costs. Might have to dig into the reserves a little bit, but there's no major significant changes that will have to be made. You might have to see slightly larger increases to either the mill rate or to operating fees, pull some reserve funds for capital, but there's not necessarily a drastic change that would need to be made in this case. If we move on to the moderate case, and if you remember, there wasn't a significant difference between those cases. There was a larger decrease in tax revenue and a slightly longer recovery period for economic growth, but they're not massively different scenarios. So in this case, you can see that from the operating costs and revenues, there's a prolonged period of running deficits. And from the debt limit standpoint, there's a number of times where the limit is breached, and later on in a pretty significant way. So when we're looking at remedies in this situation, we're looking at pretty different decisions that need to be made in the best case scenario. So we're looking at larger tax increases, larger increases to user fees, or potentially introducing new user fees. You might have to increase the size of the service cut, because in this case there was a 5% service cut. Clearly that hasn't been enough to cover those operating costs. And then on the debt side, this is likely the case where you may have to forego some of the discretionary capital in order to maintain yourself below those limits, or look for new funding sources if there's different grants available or things like that.
And Brett, one of the things about this is, as we're talking through what are the outputs and some of the graphs and the visualization of what the data shows us, and certainly some of the potential remedies, these are not surprises as to the levers that can be pulled. I think what we're demonstrating is when you see the visual and you then look at what the potential remedies are, putting those two things together, that's a different conversation that you might have had before, where administration might say, hey, we're looking through at this, I think we should delay some capital. And you could have some council members or decision makers saying, no, I campaigned on this piece of infrastructure, we need to get it done. And you can say, okay, if we make that decision, these are the impacts, are we sure? These are the remedies we'd have to enact in order to accomplish those objectives. So you're having a different conversation. It might end up doing some similar things, but you can get the data to inform the conversation in a very different way, in a very impactful way.
Yeah, and we'll touch it on later on when we talk about some of the other elements and outputs that the model produces. But there's various layers that it produces to provide different information to different people. And in terms of the graphical representation on a dashboard, there's a number more graphs that show different elements in different detail depending on what the question is and what information needs to be portrayed. I think one of the interesting things about the graphs too, as you can see from those scenarios, is it's a pretty basic, straightforward scenario that we've run. In the case of your actual operations, actual questions that may be asked, you're probably looking at the interplay between 30, 40, even more independent variables. So it's the small changes in those that then all of the sort of the outputs will just produce very quickly what those different results are. So then you spend the time talking about what those remedies are in the analysis instead of producing new graphs and new analysis. So I'll skip to when we're still on the worst case here. In case of the worst case, you can see again that it's showing that there's significant issues almost immediately in operating and very quickly within capital. So then the decisions to be made are, once again, compared to the moderate case, very different, where you're talking about maybe getting out of certain service lines that are mandatory. So I think, again, just running these scenarios very quickly allows the transition from the work going into the analysis to the work going into the questions about what to do about it. That, I will skip over to our next slide, just highlighting the process that we go through to develop the LRFM and the LRFPs. So I think the first thing, when we look at developing these models and plans, it really is a collaborative process on our end, which includes, and we're actually doing one right now, direct interviews with all the departments, senior leaderships, counselors, to see what their thoughts are from the financial health of the organization, but as well to get their insight into what would be useful for them in a model and a plan themselves. What information would they like to see? What inputs do they need to change? Because I think you know that within your own organization, you have a good idea of what will create a bigger impact. So knowing those, we can put them into the model to really customize it for you and be a good tool for your specific use, not necessarily a generic tool that we just implement and leave. Which is really like what we don't want to do, and what doesn't work is developing these plans and models in a black box where we just come in, take your information, leave, come back a few months later, hand over a tool. We don't like to do that. We won't do that. It's not useful for you. It's not useful for us. We don't get the right information or the detail that we need. and you don't get any insight into how this was developed, which makes it more difficult to use, more difficult to explain to the senior leadership what's going on in the actual model. From a high level, though, our approach generally consists of 4 different phases. The first being planning and design, where we collect and review all relevant background data, conduct those stakeholder interviews that we're discussing, and then define the assumptions and key elements that will be included in the model. And then throughout, and especially at the end of that first process, we do a pretty rigorous validation process to make sure that once we've got a template of what will be included and what won't be included, that you have a very good idea that that's exactly what you need. So after that, we will take all that information and develop the actual model with it. And again, throughout the model, this is really one of those back and forth with the finance team to be able to validate those inputs, what they are, how we put them in, and how to best change them. So kind of in the development and planning stage and development of the model, we really discuss how those inputs are tailored, whether or not be based on your actual financials, the GL data, including in the policies, strategic plans that we partially will get through from actual documentation, but then a lot of that comes through those interviews from the departments themselves as well. And I think the one thing we always want to do is we're making evidence-based assumptions. Not once have we really seen departments come back with sort of a wish list of things they'd like to do. They tend to be more conservative than even we may like. So what we're doing really is we're taking the best information now that we know about the future, the best base data and the best inputs, so that we can show sort of a trajectory based on those key policy decisions. And then one of the things we also do when we talk about inputs is we know there's a number of external factors that will impact the financial health of your organizations. So we do a significant amount of research on at the local, provincial, and national level to pull certain inputs in the model, whether that be debt rates, several different types of inflation, GDP, elements like that. And then from there, once the model's up running, everything's been validated, that's when we then take some of those outputs and create the report with it. So each one of these reports will contain specific elements that's customized to the individual organization we're working with. But there's a few things that we would like to ensure the reports have. The first being an overview of risks, challenges, and opportunities that the model itself has quantified, as well as what we've heard from our department interviews. And then from that, and as part of that, we will pull some key factors that are influencing long-range financial viability and stability, and then recommendations and a high-level implementation plan. But as I said, because each report is customized to individual circumstances, there will be other pertinent information and pieces that will be included as well. So the final step, and this is something that we make sure to take a lot of time with. To me, it's the most critical step within the entire process, is the knowledge transfer. Because what we're doing is we're handing the model over to you and your team in order to provide the benefits that we've discussed earlier. So what the final process looks like will depend on each situation, but we always conduct at least one in-person training session for you and key team members that will be maintaining the model, and include detailed instructions on use, the calculation methodologies, and data sources in the model itself. The last two are pretty critical that don't always get included, because there will always be questions on how something is calculated or brought forward. So we make sure we include the very detailed instructions and formulas in writing within the model. And then the data sources as well, because this will need to be updated quarterly, annually. Some of those things, especially around the external sources, will change. So we ensure to include all of those sources so that you're updating it from the same source. So it continues to be an apples to apples comparison from the previous years. And I know one thing that we always talk about, we love our clients, but we don't want to be back there every year to update it for you. You don't want us to be back there every year to update it for you. So this knowledge transfer process really helps ensure that when we hand it over and it becomes yours and you own it, that you really have a very thorough understanding of not only how to use it, but sort of the underlying mechanics of why the model is working.
That's right, Brett. Other thing that you and I both have in common is we came from public sector before we came into consulting. And what's been really interesting about working with this particular solution, as we tailor it to individual clients, is the fact that it's a capacity building solution. It's not something shiny and fancy, and if we leave, it's not as applicable as it was before. Our intent is to create something that's going to be very tailored and working for each client, and then the client uses it and carries on with it afterwards. A nightmare of any consultant is you do a bunch of work and you can create whether it's a nice report or some other kind of solution, and it goes on a shelf never to be used again. That's not a good use of anybody's time or resources or in investment financially. So what's exciting about this, and the feedback we've heard from other clients, is this is a great capacity building tool, not just for the functionality that it has, but also for the interactions that you have around that senior leadership table, and also with the councils or boards. Be able to get exactly what you were talking about, Brett. Let's spend less time on the analysis and building of the information and visualization, and let's spend more time on the strategic decisions that we have to make to achieve the outcomes we're trying to achieve as an organization. So really impactful, and that's what's really fascinating and interesting to work on this.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I think the one thing we talk about sort of municipal organizations a lot in this, because that's primarily who we've done them for. We've done it for other organizations as well with slightly different bents. And one we did last year was actually for the Water Security Agency in Saskatchewan. And so they have slightly different needs and challenges than a municipality will, but it's very similar where they have very, very large infrastructure and O&M requirements. So again, and they primarily handle dams and other water-based infrastructure within the province, which are sort of critical safety issues. So ensuring that they kind of know their financial stability going forward and their ability to handle those was very critical for the province. And that the same thing, I know for some larger organizations, and James will talk about some of the projects we've done before, but one that we've previously done was the initial template was designed to be able to be migrated into a non-Excel solution. In that case, it was an Oracle product, but it can be transitioned with help from our tech solutions team into a whole bunch of non-Excel type platforms as well. With that, I will move on to some of the outputs. So all of this then generates some of these outputs for insights. So we've put up a few of the sort of the key outputs that the model produces. And as James likes to say, the model isn't everything to everyone, but it produces something for everyone. So there's the number of outputs that are geared towards different audiences. So the first there being the scenario and sensitivity testing. So this really allows for a quick testing of different assumptions, whether or not that be in the scenario of changing multiple inputs, or whether or not be in the sensitivity testing that it allows you to sort of understand the impact of changing a single variable. And this all becomes, as you can kind of see on the slide there, color-coded when things aren't necessarily going the best for you. So the next, and you've seen elements of this before, those previous graphs from the scenarios came from the executive dashboard. As you can see though on this, there's a whole slew of other graphs that we can put on there. And these are always customized. There's a few specific ones that generally make it onto most of the dashboards, like the two that we saw before. But aside from that, a lot of the other graphs are customized dependent on your policy, specific reporting requirements, and your KPIs. And then the last piece, or the kind of the weeds for the finance people, is really the detailed financial reporting. And this happens at a few different levels. The blurred out picture that we're showing on the slide right now is sort of an enterprise summary view of the detailed financial reporting that includes your revenues, your operating expenses, salary, wages, other cash items like principal payments, capital, debt, reserves, as well as funding sources for capital. But then this filters back into each one of the departments. So what we're doing with what we wanted to set up with the number of reports and different outputs is that they're customized to provide different audiences with the details they need. So maybe council or boards may not be wanting to look at the detailed financial reporting, but from the finance guy or girl perspective, I know that's where I like to spend most of my time. And the other interesting thing or key thing here is that even in some of those higher level analyses, like the scenario and sensitivity testing, executive dashboards, all that information is built on that bottom-up approach from the departments as well. So even though you're not looking at all the detail, all that information and the outputs is based on that detail. But yeah, I think as we've sort of touched on a number of times before, what we want to do, or what we want the model to do, is to produce the reports, the graphs, the insights, so that you can spend more time having conversations about what to do with the analysis and less time actually creating the analysis. I think with that, I'll pass it back to James.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. I mean, and that goes right back to that whole concept. Let's not consider the mental model of a shortest distance between 2 points being a straight line. Let's put them right on top of each other. And that gets to the faster analysis and faster to those evidence-based discussions between whether it's your board administration or council administration to make some of those strategic decisions or validation of decisions that you're making already. And when you can align the priorities with capacity and resource constraints, you're going to have better outcomes. So better outcomes, whether we're measuring in the near term, when it's in the 1 to 4 year period perhaps, or in the longer term, because every decision we're making now does have longer term impacts, especially when we're talking about infrastructure. Now, this isn't just a concept like we've mentioned before. We've done this, we've worked with a number of different clients, and we'll give you a bit of a comparison between a client that's of a much larger organization and one that's a bit smaller. So we worked with the City of Regina, and I saw on registration there might have even been a few people that are from the City of Regina that were listening into this. But you'll see there's an interesting foil between this case and then the next one that we'll talk about. So City of Regina, population about 200,000, quite a large budget. And the challenge that they were facing was actually rapid population growth and causing an increasing demand for services. And the policy desire was, can we maintain or can we even increase service levels as we have this population growth? Like, can we afford it? Does it make any sense? How does this go about? So by working through a process of building the financial model, understanding the variables that were at play, and then that output of a long-range financial plan that examined those considerations, what was discovered is, by a modulation in how they're managing the reserve funds, and reducing that even requirement to have in reserve by 30%, they were able to increase those services to meet the needs of the growing population and limiting that tax burden. So it didn't come with, we want to increase services, we have to increase taxes. Use a variety of different levers to achieve the same outcome that was both feasible and politically palatable. So leaving behind that capability of not just for this issue, but for future issues, has set up the City of Regina for success. So that's a large organization that we worked with. But then we also worked and developed one for a much smaller organization, in this case, the town of Morinville. Town of Morinville is a population just around 10,000. And what they're working with is, they're growing, but they're working with kind of the competing demands. So competing demands of like how fast they just built a rec center, how fast can we go into the next phase of that rec center to meet those interests of the residents to do that? And what about the other infrastructure elements that we have to deal with? And we're not too keen on changing the tax rate, because that was kind of the position they were looking at. So they needed more understanding of the town financials, not the finance department. I think this is always critical to point out. In none of these cases was it the finance department that wanted a better understanding of the finances. They wanted a better way to have that conversation with those that were working through the strategic decision-making process. So what we're able to do through both the process of developing the model and the long-range financial plan is demonstrate the impacts of what happens with different rates of increasing on the revenue side, and what happens with the different timings of key capital programs, whether that was expansion of the rec center or other infrastructure elements on the timing, and not just saying, well, this is important to me, so push everything else down the pipe. Add the layer of asset management, and there's only so far you can move on, whether it's the maintenance or replacement programs, before you end up in a big problem. So based on debt levels, based on the revenues, you really got a different kind of conversation that allowed you to have that evidence-based perspective, to have those strategic conversations, decide, okay, what makes the most sense to be able to do when we can do it, and how am I going to have that conversation now, whether it's admitted counsel or counsel to the public. It's a different conversation where you can say, we looked at a couple different scenarios, and this is where we end up because it's the best decision that we can make, given the constraints, parameters, and opportunities that we have. And now what they've been able to do is they've built this, and they like it, and they built it into the regular budgeting process. So it's part of that implementation and that knowledge transfer, knowing where all the information comes from, keeping it up to date, and actually using it from a budgeting perspective as they worked it on the annual, the rolling 3-year basis. So we were really pleased to see, not only did it help solve the problem at hand, but they're able to integrate it, kind of raise the floor and increase that capacity, and have more conversations better and more often. So that's kind of the 2 case studies that we laid out there. What's interesting is Brett referred to the one that we're just starting up right now. And in this case, we're actually working with a municipality that is anticipating a trend of negative population growth. So looking at, well, what does that mean to finances? And there's some other regulatory issues, or rather government policies, that could also have a big impact on their revenue side, at least from the non-residential perspective. So the ability to navigate that, understand what the ramifications are and what kind of decisions they may have to make, in amongst where they also have potential of dissolution of some of the municipalities in their region, which they may absorb. So many different variables, and as you can imagine, that gets pretty complicated pretty fast to be able to just do on the back of a napkin, and time consuming to work through each scenario to figure out what the ramifications are and how to make that decision. So it's an exciting client to work with, where we feel that a tool such as the LRFM and LRFP is really going to serve their purposes both now and into the future. That's what we hope for anybody that looks at building one of these or working with us on that. And with that, kind of bringing to the end of the material that we wanted to present, I'd be happy to look at if there's any questions coming from the audience. You can type it into the chat window near the bottom of the screen there, and we can certainly walk through some of the questions in that matter. And Brett, maybe like the last one we did, if we don't see any questions come up, I'll throw some hard ones at you.
All right, there seem to be a couple in here. If you pull up the question tab on your presentation there, James.
Yep. I'm having trouble seeing it, so if you can see it, Brett, go ahead and kind of read off what the question is.
Oh, seems to be less of a question, more of a comment.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of questions about if it's going to be posted. Yes, it will be posted, and all that CACFO is going to share it both with tips and trips document, as well as a copy of the presentation. So it will be available to you. Yeah, I see there's a comment here from Aiden about decision makers looking for business intelligence solutions. And I didn't really talk about it much here in this presentation, but when we're describing this product, it's built in a model of Excel. It's scaled to a level where the at least we certainly feel, the level of investment in time and energy and financial resources to build it and then implement it is much lower than what the cost of not having it is. So there's a big return on investment that is a long ways from the scale of trying to move into and shift your whole platform and making use of highly sophisticated software. In some cases, you do need that. A large, complicated organization would need something like that. The organization, and we showed you kind of the scale at which we've worked with both a large municipality and a smaller one, can be scaled and very effective in those. The big benefit is jumping faster into the strategic conversation.
Yeah, I think the follow-up to that is an interesting one, James, about the strategies enabled to get some of those senior leadership on side. So I think one of the interesting things through this process is that all those senior leadership and council, CFOs, directors are involved in the development of the model itself. So they've got a good understanding of what's driving those insights and those visuals, which sort of leads, when we talked about not having to acclimate council and senior leadership to some of those things, that process of them being involved through those stakeholder interviews and throughout the development of the models and the plans, I think would really assist with that.
Yeah, Brett, I mean, that's a good point. It's deliberate in that process and methodology, because that's kind of the beginnings of making sure that it's going to be fit for purpose, but also, like you said, getting them used to what it's for and also what it's not for. Like, it doesn't make the decision for you, it informs the decision-making process. And the piece of point that we're often reiterating. Brett, I see a comment here too from Wendy asking to talk a bit more about the bottom-up methodology.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about the bottom-up methodology, it's that when we're developing the financials and the projections themselves, we do it at the individual department level. We don't do it at the enterprise level and then try and flow things down. So we essentially build a separate model or separate tabs for each one of the departments. So then the overall enterprise view is based on the summation of those departments. So it allows us to put a very detailed departmental level information within the model. And then that's where you get that total understanding of where impacts at department levels, whether or not be new staffing, new capital, changes to service levels, how that really has an impact on the enterprise as a whole.
Yeah, and just as we talked about, when we're engaging with council members at the beginning from, what is going to be the strategic value of the tool and making sure it's fit for purpose, working with the departments to build their information in also helps with some of that internal socialization. So when you go from, tool provided and you see that first long-range financial report, the integration with the other departments that will feed into it in future to maintain it has already been initiated. So people are getting used to it already before you've even implemented it. I think that's most of the. Okay, we have a question here on any strategies to drive the point home to the CFO. I think what I take from that comment, and Aidan, if we get it wrong, just to plug it into the comments here, is if we're looking for ways to be able to get to the decision-making process faster and spending less time on the analysis, I kind of refer to that as, if you think about it from an assembly line process, it's called blue light time when you're talking about, say, lean methodology. And blue light time, if you have a welder on the assembly line, when they're doing their highest skilled work, is that there's a blue light around them when that's happening because they're welding. Anytime they don't have that blue light, they're doing less value-added work. So whether it's reaching for a tool, whether it's resetting the environment, stuff that needs to be done, but it's taking time away from what they've gone and gotten the most training and the highest skill for. So when we look at a long-range financial model and the outputs that you can generate from that, the role of an organization, in this case, we'll just talk about municipalities. So administration is there to serve and support the council and council priorities, which are reflective of what the resident priorities are, and just the regular business of operations of the organization. that has to be done, but if we can spend less time on trying to understand what's happening and more time, focused on what could happen based on, reasonable assessments and assertions of the different variables, and therefore what are the ramifications, what would be the consequences of that, and then how we could look at avoiding those consequences and getting to that risk management conversation, the strategy conversation that says, how do we avoid all of the bad things, as many of them as we can, and get after as many of the good things as we want to hit those council priorities and deliver against those. Because at the administration level, that's our job. The best of our abilities to deliver against council priorities. So getting into that conversation, whether it's here's how we can do it, or if you set this priority, here's the consequences of that. Are we sure? Because it means these types of decisions will also have to be made. That's a more comfortable conversation to be in, rather than the imbalance of power that you'll have between a council position and an administration position. Because council has more power on a position basis. When we can discuss it based on what does the evidence demonstrate, what does the quantitative data point to, now we can end up in a conversation around, well, which variables do we want to change and why, to reset those priorities to be the most feasible and closest to achieving those priorities. So I don't know if that helped, Aiden, with your question there on how to help drive this point home to the CFO. But what we're trying to get to is, how can we do a faster job of getting the analysis to the decision makers and getting into the right decision-making conversation that's based on good data to get better both near-term and longer-term decisions. Brett, I know we heard that from one of the counselors that we're just working with on this current project, where you always have a range of perspectives around the table. For this one counselor saying like, hey, we recognize that we have decisions to make right now, and both whether it's on the operational or even on the infrastructure side. But even if they only have a certain number of terms as counselor, they're fully expecting to still be living there, and they still will also be with their neighbors, living with the consequences of decisions, good, bad, or indifferent, for the longer term. So there is a degree of excitement and interest in getting better information to have a higher level of confidence in the decision you're making.
Yeah, there's actually
level of confidence in the decision that you're making.
Yeah, I was actually interviewing a counselor on Monday, and so one of the first questions we ask in the interview process is, what value or what do you hope to get out of an LRF and an LRFP? And what he wanted was to understand the impact of his decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
So there's an understanding, I think, at the council or SLT level that their decisions will have serious ramifications going forward. So able to have something that they're used to, they've seen before, they've built that trust with, to guide those decisions based on that quantitative data is what I think a lot of them are really looking for.
With one of our clients, I remember when we first started, the director of finance had a variety of nicknames. Most of them were associated with the bringer of no. The second you brought in the director of finance, you found out why you couldn't do something. And then what shifted at the end of the project is they kind of, jokingly changed their title to the bringer of oh. Because when they saw all of the information together, like, okay, it's not just you saying no and being the dream killer. You're actually showing us what the consequences and ramifications are and what will be required to get there, and they have a different conversation. Maybe just as a final tidbit, and then we'll bring it to a close, Brett. You've done a number of these, like you said, with municipalities and with other organizations. Anything jump out to you that you want to share with the group today on, just fascinating insights or things that you've seen that were really notable to you in the process or in the outcomes?
Yeah, and I know we've discussed this before, James, and one of the things that I always find really interesting that when we're going into these never really gets brought up within the whole process of starting one of these projects is the importance and the use of reserve funds within municipalities and other organizations. that's, I don't know how much insight there is. It's just very interesting as how when we go through and we start talking about funding of capital, funding sources, operating, and sort of annual contributions to reserves and policies around them, and investment decisions and policies around reserves, how they take up a significant portion of effort and time that we put into them. And I think going in, we know that we want to discuss those and talk about the reserve funds a lot because of their relative importance when it comes to primarily the capital side, but the operating as well.
100%. Yeah, it's often interesting to see what they have in reserves and how little attention that gets, except for when perhaps a counselor sees those numbers and says, "Hey, can we spend that now?" But all joking aside, you know what? I will just give a big thank you to all of the participants today. Thanks for taking time out of your day to listen to Brett and I. This is something that we find quite interesting, and we're really pleased to share. And that thanks, Lee, to you and your group at CAG4 for giving us the opportunity to talk about this today. Not sure if perhaps Lee's audio is not working, but thanks everyone. Have a wonderful day. And if you have any questions or follow-up pieces for us, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just say thank you to both of you very quickly, seeing as we have another mute issue on our hands. But thank you very much. That was a wonderful webinar and looks like some great feedback. So thanks for your time and your efforts.
Not a problem. Thanks very much for having us.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.